About a year ago, I made this video. The top 10 reasons The Force Awakens was just okay. And now, Rogue One has come out. I feel like I have to tell you the top 10 reasons Rogue One was just okay. Before we continue, I need to clarify two things. One, this one is called the top 10 reasons Rogue One is just okay for continuity, because that's what I called the Force Awakens video. In reality, I like this video, or I like this movie, even less than Force Awakens. And the other second thing I need to clarify is that the reasons, the real reasons, are a lot broader than what I'm going to put into this video. I'll kind of summarize it at the end. So, without further ado, I know what you're thinking. Chris, why are you using that thing you used in the Force Awakens video? This movie didn't have a crawl. You should have some other kind of transition between the parts. No. Because number one is it not having a crawl. I understand. Everybody says, oh, it makes sense, it's not a main Star Wars movie. They need to differentiate it from the other movies to, kind of help drive home the fact that it's a side story and not a main story. Here's the problem. The crawl in the other movies sort of gave you a background on what's going on, kind of covered some more boring parts, parts that we don't really need to see, so you can get right to the story happening. Beginning of episode 4, you get the crawl that actually mentions, the people getting the Death Star plans, and when it starts off, the Empire is boarding the ship, they're trying to get the plans, like it's action right off the bat. Rogue One starts off, you see a ship, you see him going to get Galen Erso because they need him to help complete the Death Star. You see a bunch of stuff with Jen going to hide and Saw Gerrera getting her out of the cave. And there's a lot that happens in the first 30 or 40 minutes that seem kind of necessary to get you to where things are really going, where she's now older, she's basically on her own. The problem with that is the first 30 or 40 minutes being kind of slow and boring are the best argument for this movie needing a crawl. Okay, you're not going to give me a crawl, then give me like a compelling, interesting intro to the movie, to these new characters, and it didn't feel like they did that right. They gave us a slow, but necessary intro, but it wouldn't have been necessary if it just would have been covered in the crawl. So number 2 is the music in this movie. It was announced a long time ago John Williams would not be doing the music for this movie. Obviously, like The Crawl, they're trying to distance this movie from the other movie. They want to make sure you understand this is a side story, this is an extra story, this is a not necessary to the rest of the movies. If you don't watch this, you're probably not going to miss anything in other movies. It gives some weight to the beginning of A New Hope, but other than that, largely you could skip this. But the problem is that the music ends up sounding like a video game soundtrack or like a fan movie. Because every song, maybe the first note, or maybe 2 or 3 notes, you're like, oh, the Imperial March. Oh no, wait, it almost was. And then you hear like the main Star Wars song, and you're like, oh, that's not really, it almost was, and then it was completely different. That weird decision to make everything seem kind of familiar. We want you to think it's Star Wars, but we don't want you to think it's really Star Wars, but it is really Star Wars. It's just such a weird decision, and the music was one of the most in-your-face examples of that because it was throughout the entire movie, consistently off. Number 3 is a kind of broad one. The usage of characters that we've seen before from other movies. All of the other characters were handled badly. At the end, we didn't need to see Leia. She looked weird. Knowing it's not her, knowing it's a CG face, it can simultaneously look really good and look awful, and that's how Leia looked. You know how Tarkin would have been better used? As a hologram, would have been less obvious. Like, obviously we know that it's not really him because he was old then, he's dead now. But having him as like a hologram or on like a disc, like a weird looking display like they've seen before, something like that would have made a lot more sense. And using him a lot less. When it was just a reflection, I was like, oh, they're gonna let us know it's him, but they're not gonna like focus on his face because it's obviously gonna be a CG face. Then he turned around and then they kept it on him, and then there were multiple scenes with him and Krennic. And I was like, what are you doing? The more he's on screen, the more you're like, this doesn't look good. What are you doing? Why are you doing this? You don't need to do this. R2-D2 and C-3PO, we know where they are at the end of the movie because we've seen the beginning of A New Hope. We know they're on the ship with Leia. We don't need to see them at the port about to leave. Obviously the biggest one, I think. They used them too much. They could have used them really sparingly. The scene where he's talking to Craddock seemed completely pointless. I know a lot of people are complaining about the line where he says, don't choke on your aspirations. Yeah, it was a bad pun. I don't think it's completely out of line with some of the things that he said before, but that whole scene just seemed completely unnecessary. You could have just cut this out. Yeah, I think they just handled all of the classic Star Wars characters that are in this badly. They didn't do a good job with any of them. The Vader fight at the end, as you've probably heard 100 different people say, they always say the last 5 minutes are the best part of the movie, or the last 20 minutes. Basically, the end of the movie is the best part of the movie. My guess is that a lot of people are going to realize that this really wasn't that great a movie as time goes on. Because you're going to realize it's like, oh man, let's talk about all the great parts of Rogue One. They'll be like the Darth Vader fight, and then, I don't know. 4, this is a really quick one for number 4. Going into the movie, I knew most likely all of Rogue One is going to die. The way I would have wanted it, and the way I was hoping for it, was that Darth Vader was going to kill them, or at least kill a couple of them. Pointed out to some friends on my Nerdtastic 4 podcast. Go check us out at nerdtastic4.podbean.com. And they pointed out, it's like, well, the story would have had to have been completely different for Darth Vader to, like, be on the planet with them. And Darth Vader killing those specific people wouldn't really line up with the story. And I'm like, you're right. This whole story, I feel like they should have written completely differently. And even in the trailers, they kind of led us to believe that Jyn and Vader would meet. The way that they cut the footage together gave a lot of people that impression. Jyn might not even know who Darth Vader is. She lived on an Empire ship with her dad. She probably does know, but he killed a bunch of nameless rebels. Like I said in the last point, it was a cool scene. There was a bunch of characters I didn't care about. But imagine Jyn being the one trying to get the plans through the door. But his lightsaber going through Jyn as she handed it through the doorway, that would have been crazy intense. Alright, so they find these plans that are on like a tape disc type thing. They have to manually transmit it, so they take it to the top of this tower. When it gets transmitted to the rebel ship, they get the signal, and what do? They copy it to a little disc. They don't transmit it to other ships. You know, if we put it in 100 different places, they won't be able to take it away from us. Nope. Let's just get the information, download it, put on this little disc, give it to that guy. Have him take it to Leia 2 ships away. That just didn't make any sense to me. See, this is one of those things you think, it's like, well, they had to write it in a way that it would get to Leia. Rewrite the whole movie. Number 6. Big one. Big story problem. Would be solved in my rewrite, probably. Galen sends this message with the pilot to take it to Saw Gerrera, and it's a hologram of him talking about building a weakness into the Death Star. He says all these things in his hologram. Why didn't he send the plans with the pilot? We talked about this on our podcast, nerdtastic4.podbean.com. He probably couldn't. Even though he designed the entire Death Star, he's probably working under super close supervision. The files he creates probably get put into his secure server. And it's like, okay, we can make up reasons, but this is one of those things that like really matters to the plot a lot. And they don't go into any kind of explanation about why he didn't just send the plans with the pilot whenever he left. This could have easily been fixed. One, explain in the movie, in the little hologram. Like, I would send the plans myself, but like they're under lock and key. That line, bam, number 6 wouldn't be in this list. Given the information we have in the movie, he should have been able to send it and didn't. Number 7's kind of a funny one, I think. Saw Gerrera, whenever they're leaving, they're like, we have to go. Jin's like, come on, let's go. He says some cliche line like, I'm done running, whatever. And he dies. This is one of those moments in a movie where I think to myself, this is the way they wrote him saying, they're not paying me enough to be in this movie more. Because him dying doesn't make any sense. He finally is reunited with Jyn, with the video that's been given to him by the pilot of his old friend. He now has something to fight for, a reason to keep fighting. And when they say, hey, we have to go get in the ship if we want to live, he says, no, I'm just gonna stay here and die. Why? Just done. Like, okay, cool. Number 8 is one of those story elements that they kind of had to figure out what to do because of what was established in the older movies. In episode 4, the Death Star destroys Alderaan, and they make it very clear that this is the first test of it actually destroying a planet. So, they couldn't let the Death Star destroy a planet in Rogue One. In my mind, there's 2 ways to do that. In the movie, they decide to lower the power and just destroy a city. It's always been my understanding that the way the Death Star destroys planets is the beam goes into the core of the planet, and when it hits the core, that's what causes the planet to explode. Pretend his whole circle nose thing is a planet. The Death Star beam goes and goes straight through the center, hits the metal, explodes. Because it hits the core of the planet. If it went like this and went across the top, it would just cut a hole through it, because it's just hitting dirt. In this movie, they decide to lower the power to set it to where it can just destroy a city, something it never does in the other movies. And whenever it hits the city, it causes a huge explosion. And in this movie, it's revealed that the Death Star is powered by kyber crystals, which are used to power lightsabers. And lightsabers don't just cause things to explode when they touch them, because you've seen them cut through doors, cut through people. You don't like hit a door with a lightsaber and it makes the door explode. So the fact that like the Death Star has some setting where basically this giant lightsaber touches a city and then the city explodes, maybe it's just because I don't understand how the Death Star works. It just seems like a weird way to avoid destroying a planet. Do you want to hear how I would have kept them from destroying a planet in this movie? It would have required a rewrite for a lot of the movie because of the way they did this. Don't have it shoot at all. Have it be not quite operational. You know, if you're going to have the scene where Darth Vader says, like, there is no Death Star. Okay, have him say, you're not using that. That would have been fine. Just don't use it. Say it's not finished. Something. This is a little bit of a personal one, because I know a lot of people don't agree with me on this at all, is that I never got to the point where I cared about any of these characters. Cassian was like the main rebel guy. That actor to me wasn't very good. It felt like he kept changing his accent. Jyn being all hopeful and like cooperative just from seeing the hologram of her dad. It would have made more sense for her to kind of struggle with it, and maybe when she actually saw her dad, like if they would have forced her to go with them to get her dad, and then like when her dad's dying he said something and that's what made her, you know, be more agreeable and hopeful and everything. The blind monk dude and the dude with the gun, they were cool characters. I probably cared more about them than the others just because they were consistent throughout. They were simple characters to understand, so like within a couple of scenes I was able to get, you know, these guys have probably worked together for a long time. There's definitely the camaraderie there with him kind of like giving him crap for doing the whole I'm one with the Force is with me. But like when they died I was just like, oh, alright. And that might be because I went in expecting them all to die. Number 10 is just going to be sort of the main problem I had. That was also a theme throughout a lot of these points, was the idea that it's not a Star Wars movie, but it is a Star Wars movie. There's no opening crawl. There's no John Williams music. There's no Jedi. Cool, so it's not a Star Wars movie. Yeah, but we got Leia and Tarkin and Vader and the R2-D2 C-3PO cameo. And then over here on the not Star Wars side, we got like the text coming up telling us what planet we're going to. Even though they'd say, we have to go to here. And then it would just say it in the corner. And I'm like, they just said that. What? I feel like they just kind of walked the line on it. And they needed to commit fully to it not being really a Star Wars movie or it being a Star Wars movie. And it felt more like a Star Wars movie than not a Star Wars movie, which left me wanting an opening crawl, John Williams music. Those are the top 10 reasons Rogue One was just okay. If you agree or disagree, leave a comment. I'll be in the comments talking. Nobody watches these things, so it's easy for me to keep talking to all of you. I'm going to now have a conversation with the opening crawls that I've been adding throughout the video. So opening crawl, what did you think of my problems with Rogue One? That's not what your mom said. What do you mean my hat's upside down? Thank you for watching. Stay tuned for more videos, maybe. Who knows? I do, you don't.